My father-in-law secretly controlled 8 bank accounts in my name until my divorce. Set me free. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I'm 34 years old. 40 minutes after my divorce was finalized, I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and called my bank's fraud department. My voice was flat, almost robotic, when I said the words, "I need to report identity misuse across 8 accounts opened in my name." The woman on the other end asked me to confirm my date of birth. I had to say it twice because my mouth wouldn't cooperate. My father, Walter Whitfield, spent 30 years building a mid-sized commercial real estate firm, from a 2-desk office above a dry cleaner into a company that developed strip malls and office parks across 3 counties. He never handed me the business. He handed me something else instead. A trust set up when I turned 28, worth just under $2 million. Money my grandmother left me. Money that was supposed to be untouchable. I married Julian Ashford 6 years ago, and from the very first Sunday dinner at his parents' house, his father, Cornelius Ashford, looked at me less like a daughter-in-law and more like an asset class. He never said it outright. Instead, he said things like, "In this family, we protect wealth the smart way. Let me help you structure things properly." Cornelius was a financial advisor, the kind with a corner office, a silver tongue, and a client list that had been quietly shrinking for years, though I didn't know that part yet. Over our 2nd year of marriage, Cornelius convinced me, gently, patiently, that my trust needed asset protection restructuring. He said keeping all that money in one account was reckless. Estate taxes, liability exposure, divorce protection, he said, with a small laugh, like the idea of Julian and me ever splitting up was absurd. He recommended I open several new accounts, each one designed to hold a portion of the trust for diversification. He'd handle the paperwork. I just needed to sign. I signed 8 times over 18 months. I trusted him because Julian trusted him, and because for the first 2 years, the statements Cornelius forwarded me showed steady, modest growth. Nothing flashy, nothing that raised alarms. I was busy running my own small design firm, busy being a wife, busy believing that this was simply what functional families did. They took care of each other's money. It took me 4 years to notice the pattern. It started with a single letter from a bank I didn't recognize, addressed to me, referencing a business line of credit I had never applied for. When I called, the representative confirmed the account existed, opened under my social security number, with an outstanding balance of $340,000. I told her there had to be a mistake. She read me the opening date. It matched, almost exactly, the week Cornelius's investment fund had quietly lost 3 major clients, something I only learned about later, and only because I went looking. I didn't say anything to Julian. Not yet. Instead, I hired a forensic financial investigator named Renata Cho, and I paid her out of a checking account Cornelius didn't know I still had. We met on weekends in her cramped office above a nail salon. Because I couldn't risk anyone at Julian's family seeing us together, what she found took 9 months to untangle completely. All 8 of my diversification accounts had, at some point, been used as collateral for loans tied to Cornelius's failing fund. 2 had been drained almost entirely and refilled with smaller deposits to avoid triggering the bank's fraud algorithms. One account, the largest, had over $600,000 routed through it in a single 18-month period. Money that ultimately landed in a shell entity called Ashford Capital Holdings, registered not to Cornelius, but to his brother-in-law, a man I'd met exactly twice at Christmas. In total, Renata traced just over $1.1 million of my grandmother's trust, money meant for me, cycled through accounts I'd never actually controlled. to prop up a business that was already dying and to hide it from Cornelius's own partners. I raised it with Julian once, carefully over dinner, sliding one bank statement across the table like it was something fragile. He looked at it for a long moment and then told me I must be misreading it, that his father had handled money for half the family for 20 years without a single problem, that I was letting stress from work make me paranoid. When I brought it up again a month later, he got quiet in a different way, cold, distant, and said I sounded like I was accusing his father of something ugly, and that maybe I needed to let the professionals handle what I clearly didn't understand. That was the moment I stopped talking to Julian about it entirely. I didn't confront Cornelius. I didn't confront Julian. I filed for divorce instead, quietly, citing irreconcilable differences, and I let Renata's full report sit sealed in a drawer at my lawyer's office until the ink on my decree was dry. Some people would call that cowardly. I call it patient, because the moment I was legally free of the marriage, free of the assumption that Cornelius's decisions were somehow also mine to defend, I could finally act without a shred of guilt holding me back. Sitting in that parking lot in the fading afternoon light, I called the bank's fraud line first. Then I called Renata. Then I called my lawyer and told her to release the full report to every institution where those 8 accounts existed, along with a formal request to freeze all remaining balances and flag every transaction tied to Ashford Capital Holdings. Within 3 hours, 4 of the accounts were frozen. Within a week, 2 banks had opened their own internal fraud investigations. I wish I could tell you that was the hardest part. It wasn't. That same evening, while I was still living out of moving boxes in a rental 2 towns over, Cornelius Ashford showed up at my door. In 8 years, I had never once heard the man raise his voice above a boardroom murmur. He was pounding on my door hard enough that a neighbor's dog started barking 3 houses down when I opened it. He didn't wait for a greeting. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said. His face flushed, a vein I'd never noticed before standing out on his temple. He said I'd triggered a chain reaction that would destroy people who had nothing to do with any of this. Investors, employees, his own reputation built over 3 decades. He said family money moves in complicated ways, that I was too naive to understand structured finance, and that if I didn't call the banks tomorrow and reverse the freeze, I would regret it for the rest of my life. I stood there in my doorway, watching a man I had spent 6 years quietly deferring to shake with a rage he could no longer control. And for the first time, I felt completely calm. "You need to leave," I told him. My voice came out steadier than I expected. He laughed, sharp and humorless, and told me I'd built a fantasy out of misunderstood paperwork, that every dollar in those accounts had a legitimate explanation, that I was about to embarrass this family in front of people who mattered. "The forensic report says otherwise," I said, "and it's already with 3 separate banks." Something shifted in his face then, just slightly, a flicker under all that fury, and I knew he understood I wasn't bluffing. He tried a different approach after that, softer, almost pleading. "Julian still loved me," he said. "This could all be smoothed over quietly, family to family, if I would just call off the investigation and let the accounts settle the way they were always meant to." I almost admired the speed of the pivot, how quickly threats turned to tenderness. I told him there was no version of that available to him anymore. The divorce was final. The report was already out, and if he wanted to contest any of it, he was welcome to do so in front of a judge, where every transaction routed through Ashford Capital Holdings would become a matter of public record. That was when he stopped pretending and started threatening lawsuits instead. His lawyers, his connections, people who owed him favors. I closed the door. The weeks that followed were harder than I expected. Not because I doubted what I'd done, but because unwinding 4 years of tangled paperwork meant fighting 3 banks, 2 regulators, and my own exhaustion all at once. My father brought in his firm's finance attorney to help me push the fraud claims through faster, and for the first time in years, I watched someone actually fight for me instead of asking me to stay quiet for the sake of peace. Julian called exactly once, 3 weeks after his father showed up at my door. His voice was quiet in a way I hadn't heard in years. He didn't defend Cornelius. He didn't defend the accounts. He just asked how I was holding up, and for a moment, the version of him I'd married showed through the version his father had spent a decade building around him. I told him I was doing better than I had in years. I meant it. He didn't call again. The lawsuits Cornelius promised never materialized. His own attorney, once he reviewed the forensic trail, quietly advised him that pursuing me would only draw federal attention to Ashford Capital Holdings faster than it was already coming. 2 of his remaining investors pulled out within the month. His brother-in-law's shell company was dissolved before year's end, presumably to bury what paperwork remained before regulators came looking too closely. I never pursued criminal charges myself, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the state's financial regulators had already picked up the trail on their own, and my lawyer told me plainly that a formal SEC inquiry would do more lasting damage to Cornelius's name than anything I could file personally. Watching 30 years of careful reputation unravel in real time, in front of the same country club crowd he'd spent decades impressing, felt like enough. 8 months later, every dollar the banks could trace back to my original trust, just over $900,000 of it, was recovered and restored, minus what Cornelius had already burned through, trying to keep his fund alive. My father's attorney helped me restructure what remained under a trust no one but me could touch, ever again. No matter how persuasively someone explained why that was inconvenient. I stood in my new apartment last spring, going through the final settlement paperwork, sunlight coming through a window I'd picked out myself, in a building no one in that family had ever set foot in. And for the first time since I said I do, I felt like my own name, on paper and everywhere else, actually belonged to me.